Am I ready to share screen?
Not yet. So I'll do our little introduction here again.
Okay.
So thank you, everybody, for coming to our third lecture of the fall lecture series. Tonight, speaking to us is Dr. Minoa Uffelman, a professor of history at Austin Peay State University. She's going to talk about the diary of Serepta Jordan, who wrote in her diary every day between 1857 and 1864. So Serepta lived through a good part, was an eyewitness to the Civil War. Dr. Minoa Uffelman teaches U.S. South and Women at Austin Peay. She also has edited Nanny Haskins Williams and was the editor of Tennessee Women in the Progressive Era, which I highly recommend. A second volume of Tennessee Women in the Progressive Era is going to be coming out soon, either in 2021 or 2022. And Minoa told me this week that she's working on the letters of Mary Kennedy. So she is really establishing herself as the authority on women writing during the Civil War. And tonight she's going to talk to us about Rep, as she was called by her family. Okay, so Minoa, if you want to share your screen now, I will stop sharing my screen and we will give you the floor.
Okay. Is it up?
No, I can't see it. I can just see a little tiny thing down in, no. Let me make sure I've made you the host. Oh, there we go. There we go.
Okay. Are we good?
You are good to go.
I want to thank the Tennessee Historical Society for inviting me to talk about Serepta Jordan. Jennifer had asked me a couple of years ago, and I said I wanted to wait until the diary was published. In the non-pandemic world, I would be speaking at Fort Negley in person, but we are virtual, and therefore people from all over the country, and we know Washington State is represented, are able to listen. So thank you for joining. I co-edited this diary with, first let me say, I didn't edit the first volume of the Progressive Women. Mary Evans did, but I am helping with the second volume. And Mary needs credit for that. I co-edited this diary with Eleanor Williams, Montgomery County historian, Ellen Canervo, professor emerita at Austin Peay State University and director of Clarksville, Montgomery County Arts and Heritage, and Phyllis Smith, retired teacher, Civil War reenactor, and historian of Mount Olive Cemetery. As Jennifer mentioned, the first diary we edited was Nanny Haskins Williams, who lived about 7 miles from where Serepta lived. It was published in 2014. Serepta was our second diary, and we are working on the we're well on our way, the Sarah Kennedy Civil War letters. This is a picture of Serepta standing in this beautiful dress that she would have made. She kept a voluminous diary from 1857 to 1864. The name Serepta is a biblical name meaning goldsmith shop, but nothing in Serepta's life was golden. Her life was filled with tragic loss, separation, and sadness. The identity of her mother was, her father was a mystery until recently, despite the genealogists and archivists searching for years. Her mother's name was Demarius Trice, but recently Montgomery County archivist Jill Hastings, who's on tonight, discovered a Robertson County will probated in 1836 that listed a man named William Jordan as husband of Demarius. So we know her father's name was William, and he died, but we still don't know when he died. But by 1844, Demarius had remarried, and she married a widower named John Bennett, who had a daughter about Serepta's age. Together, they had 3 more children. When Serepta was 12, her mother died, and young Rep left the family she'd been with and went to live with her maternal aunt, Tabitha Trice, in New Providence. Ironically, Serepta was listed in two censuses in 1850, Callaway County, Kentucky with Bennett, and Montgomery County with Trice. The diary was discovered in a smokehouse in New Providence in the mid-1980s and donated to the Customs House Museum and Cultural Center in Clarksville. It is a well-constructed store ledger with thick, sturdy covers. Initially, Serepta's great-granddaughter, Evelyn Glenn Hunter, worked relentlessly to have the diary transcribed, recruiting her friends to help. She asked retired APSU English professor Charlie Holt to begin editing, annotation, and pursue publication. The editing was a monumental task, given the length of the diary and the scores of family, friends, neighbors, enslaved people, and acquaintances she wrote of. Additionally, Jordan maximized writing space by sometimes writing crossways and in the margins. Holt improved the transcript, but eventually dropped the project. Then, for the next 15 years, Aunt Allie, a retired archivist from Tennessee State Library and Archives, spent countless hours continuing to research places, people, and trying to build a family tree. At some point along in the editorial process, someone, and I don't know who, decided the published diary should start when Serepta first used the word disunion, and that was on September 7th, 1860. The assumption being that only the Civil War was interesting. This decision excluded the first 3 years of the diary, and we as editors could not disagree more. We believe including the years leading up to the war gives invaluable insight into what Southerners experienced as a sectional crisis inched closer to armed conflict. When we got the diary from Anne, it was 500 typed pages without very many footnotes. Well, there were some footnotes, but they needed many, many more. There were no photos, there was no introduction, there was no index, and it was much too long to be an affordable book. So the editors cut we spent months. We cut about 100 pages. We were determined to keep the integrity of the diary by maintaining the same balance of local news, descriptions of her labor, war news, descriptions of her networks of friends and neighbors. And we as a group discussed every cut and came to a consensus before we hit the cut. In 2017, Customs House Curator of Collections, Callie Mason, received a TSLA grant to conserve the diary, and it was sent to Boston. Experts cleaned the delicate pages and put them in protective covers. The thick journal covers that protected Serepta's entries from the elements were beyond repair, but the sturdy binding had served its purpose. We have the diary. So this is bullet points of what is you can learn from the diary. And I'm going to talk more about these in the presentation. The diary gives a good description of everyday life, food, labor, clothes, births, deaths. She describes the first agricultural fair in the county. She describes gender roles in marriage, her religious life, political conflict, military camp life, preparations for war, military occupation, and the breakdown of slavery. This is the first page of the diary. You can tell that it is a ledger book. You can see numbers on the right-hand column. So she just maximized what space that she had. And you can see there's damage from the elements after being in a smokehouse for we don't know how many years. It's a large diary, and it's a thick diary, and it's a heavy diary. once again, you can see some more of the damage. But you can also see that it's still well preserved. This is the finished product that University of Tennessee published. And if I may say so, I think this is a beautiful, beautiful cover. I think they did a fabulous job with it. This picture is in these pictures are in the family possessions. Serepta is on the left, and the family believes that this is her Aunt Tabitha on the right. And it is faded, but it's certainly a treasure. This is a drawing made from the picture that we just looked at. And also, the family had, through the years, had kept, there was a dress, and this is it. It's in the museum now. She was a very small, tiny woman. They had to cut the styrofoam mannequin down so that the dress would fit it. 3 of her hats have survived, and she was very interested in fashion.
I don't know.
She also, this image on the left is a drawstring purse that she made. You can see that it's got a lot of detail, tatting, and it's embroidered. And this is a shawl that the family also has donated to the museum. And we don't usually get so much to survive. This is her Bible. She went to church every Sunday. Sundays she would go to church, she would come home and she would have a big dinner, then she would write what she had heard at church, and then she would give a critique of the sermon. In this particular sermon, she said it was excellent, his delivery was good, his style easy, and calculated to attract the attention of the congregation. But she would also say that, talk about those she didn't like. So these are the books that survived. And she, in the diary, mentions these particular books that she read. And they're big, thick tomes, serious histories, theologies. And these books have her handwritten notes in them. This is this is her. This is who she married, Beverly Bladden Beverly Homer. He was a widower with 1 daughter, Betty. He was about 20 years older than her. He was related to the Trice family by marriage, and he courted her throughout the entire diary. He's there regularly. He's constantly pursuing her, even though she had 2 other young men who visited with her and went into the Confederacy and wrote her after they left. This is the picture of Serepta. This is the picture of Serepta. I'm going to leave up while I give my presentation so that when you're listening, you can imagine this is the woman I'm talking about. The diary begins in 1857 when she was 18, and she lived with her Aunt Tabitha and the husband, L.C. Trice. He was involved in several enterprises. He ran a cooper shop, stored and shipped tobacco and other products such as lumber and tree. He also traded horses. Serepta had a warm and loving relationship with her Aunt Tabby, and her entries show deep and mutual affection. The diary offers wonderful insights into the daily life in New Providence and Clarksville during the buildup of the war, the secession crisis, war preparations, conflict, and occupation. Serepta was never idle, and she described a dizzying array of activities. Entries are filled with different types of labor she performed, courtship, her regular church attendance. She's mentioned she would talk about the commentaries of the sermons. She described her complex networks of friends and neighbors. And she would write about slavery, but slavery was simply part of everyday life. She was a prodigious seamstress, and she would list the scores of items she made with wonderful descriptions of details of fabric, trim, and sewing techniques. She wanted to be stylish, and she asked people who had traveled north to describe the latest trends. She pored over any fashion book she could obtain. She made nets for women's hair and pocket watch holders. In her urban community of New Providence, with Clarksville just across the river, she had easy access to retail stores, a variety of churches, closeness to telegraph and public transportation, repair shops, undertakers, and professional services and local newspapers. She lived near Trice's Landing, where barges and boats brought people from all parts of the South, sharing news, newspapers, and gossip. Yet despite living in town, the labor she performed would not have been different from the chores of rural women. Town and country people ate the same foods based on the seasons, not just vegetables and fruits, but she also wrote of oyster season. She fished and she caught birds with nets. She once complained her uncle could not kill hogs because the weather had turned too warm. Like her country sisters, she made wreaths of hair to remember someone and created flower beds for beauty. She raised a garden, baked cakes, pies, and breads. Meat for supper might be squirrel, groundhog, or partridge. Food preservation included making wine and drying fruit. As with most Southerners, oranges were a treat at Christmas. She mentioned some canned products such as peaches. A couple of entries describe her bitter class resentment toward the elite ladies of Clarksville. Today, New Providence is part of Clarksville, just across the Red River. But in the mid-19th century, they were separate, and the two areas experienced class rivalries between the old moneyed Clarksvillians and the merchant class of New Providence. You might say it was akin to living on the wrong side of the tracks, but in this case, it was the wrong side of the river. Interestingly, for this editor, she saved particular invective for a certain Mrs. Haskins, Nanny's mother, who deigned to cross the river to deal with her social inferiors in New Providence to solicit war aid. This is the only reference that Jordan made about Mrs. Haskins, and she revealed deep anger and bitterness. And I about fell out of my seat when I read it. In the months leading up to the war, Rep described the first Montgomery County Agricultural Fair. I find this particularly interesting because the nation is in crisis, headed toward war, headed toward conflict. But the locals in Montgomery County were looking to the future, and they planned this elaborate fair to promote agricultural products and livestock and to publicize Clarksville, Montgomery County as an important progressive city, ready to market its products across the state and country using railroads and rivers. The city leaders coordinated with an astonishing number of people in the public sector, private sector, government, business. What the city thought would be the first grand fair in a long tradition of fairs was not to be because of the war. Indeed, everyone that attended, and it was very well attended, would have had their lives profoundly changed. And certainly some of those who attended the fair would perish during the war. After the successful fair, daily life returned to normal rhythms for a while. National news, however, would be anything but ordinary. November 6, 1860, Serepta's entry was long and newsy about visiting people. Then she writes simply, "Today is the presidential election, and I never knew less excitement, notwithstanding the number of candidates, Bell, Lincoln, Breckinridge, and Douglas." In late 1860, Clarksville had a population of about 5,000 and was overwhelmingly Unionist. But after Fort Sumter, attitudes swung toward secession. In 1861, in a statewide referendum, Montgomery County overwhelmingly favored secession. In preparation for war, citizens raised local units and established 4 recruiting and training camps. Young men and Stuart College students joined the Confederate Army. A chemistry professor commanded the unit of students, which was later incorporated into the 14th Infantry, part of the Army of Northern Virginia, and they fought in virtually every battle in the Eastern Theater. Of the 29 seniors, 16 were killed, 7 died of disease or wounds, 6 survived. In Stuart College, Austin Peay is on the same location that Stuart College was. Clarksville and New Providence were strategically important as they sat on the confluence of the Cumberland and Red Rivers, and these market towns were heavily dependent on processing and shipping tobacco. Pig iron was an important industry, and hundreds of workers, including enslaved men, refined ore, and the foundries were among the nation's leading iron producers. There were also numerous slaughtering houses. The Confederacy had counted on these war resources, but the Union benefited instead. Women in communities across the country formed organizations to support the war effort. The women of New Providence formed the Volunteers Friends Association in April of 1861, and Serepta was elected secretary. Fort Donelson fell in February of 1862, and this was the beginning of the end of the Confederacy. Clarksville surrendered, and a few days later, Nashville was the first Confederate capital to surrender. Entries during this period include stories of chaos and violence, both thievery and legitimate appropriating of goods, livestock, produce were devastating to local farmers and merchants. Locals sold goods to the military, to the Confederacy before the surrender, and to the Union during occupation. Serepta was desperate to obtain reliable news of the war and was skeptical of Union newspapers. In the early months of occupation, she reported the rumors of troop movements and was knowledgeable of commanders and strategies. She wrote, "Latest news from Clarksville and Nashville. Both have raised white flags. Clarksville is almost depopulated. All the escaped soldiers have been ordered to the main army via Clarksville before the Yankees get in. I ripped the stripes off a young man's coat over at Uncle William's this evening so that he might not be detected on his journey. Once I enjoyed sewing them on. Now I take them off just as willingly." Clarksville and New Providence were nominally behind Union lines at this point. A garrison was left at Donelson, but most Union soldiers headed south toward Shiloh to capture the railroad junction at Corinth, Mississippi. Montgomery County underwent sporadic occupation and patrol. February 23rd, she wrote, "Mr. H says 2 regiments are stationed at the fort and 1 or more are in Clarksville. Our streets are seldom clear of the rowdies, and splendidly dressed officers prancing around on their fine horses are sights not uncommon. The wounded from Fort D continue to come in. Forrest and his brave company had possession of our town in place of the Lincoln Negro worshipers," end quote. The Confederates did not hold the town long, and a permanent Union garrison was established. Still, the situation was dangerous. Most people stayed home to avoid trouble. In 1862, troops vandalized Stuart College, stripping it bare of books and scientific equipment. Soldiers arrested preachers and required oaths of allegiance from worshipers. They commandeered horses and wagons, and businessmen had to take the oath to conduct business. Serepta rightly observed, quote, "Tennessee is now a conquered province," end quote. Travel required passes, and Serepta chafed when pickets demanded compliance, complained that it made her feel like, quote, she was a citizen of Yankeedom. She hated the sounds of different accents and languages spoken by Union soldiers. Quote, if a couple of ladies wish to make a call, they must be halted and rudely questioned by a set of ignoramuses using a greater variety of languages that was known at the building of the Tower of Babel. She hated the demon abolitionist and called Andrew Johnson a dark-hearted and treacherous Arnold who was in, quote, a Negro stealing, liberty displacing party. By April of 1862, Clarksville, New Providence experienced an uneasy truce. Serepta wrote, us poor semi-Lincolnites, here we are, exactly situated on the line that separates Lincolndom from Dixie. We neither share to great extent the disgrace of one, nor enjoy the privileges of the other. But after all, we are tolerably quiet. As the war raged, news of deaths and casualties reached New Providence, and she recorded the names of the dead and injured from the local regiments, the 14th, 49th, and 50th. Jordan's world was devastated on July 2nd, 1861, when her aunt died suddenly at a huge community party to honor the newly enlisted local soldiers held in one of the hastily constructed camps. The celebration of Southern patriotism was in full swing as friends and neighbors came to bid the soldiers farewell. At the party, Aunt Tabby collapsed, and the local physician was too drunk to attend her. The local newspaper reported her death, but ironically neglected to put her name. Quote, sudden death. The wife of Elsie Trice of New Providence fell dead at Camp Quarles on Tuesday last, while on a visit to the camp from a stroke. Up until the time of the attack, she appeared to be enjoying usual good health, and at the time was removing some articles of provisions which she had taken out for some of the boys from a basket. Serepta poured her grief and sorrow out on page after page of the journal. She was shattered and feared for her future, with good reason. Her Uncle Trice immediately turned his eye toward courting a widowed neighbor named Fanny. Soon they married, and the new Mrs. Trice wanted Serepta out of her new home and treated Serepta coldly. Without writing a word of love about B.B. Homer, Serepta married him. Once, while visiting her aunt's grave, she noted the cemetery allowed her to, quote, enjoy the quiet beauty, the calm, peaceful stillness that nowhere else to be found. The stillness of this place seemed striking in contrast to the stir and the confusion of the outer world. Still, the war deaths could not be escaped. Nearby, she observed, quote, the soldiers' graves were found more numerous than we had anticipated. Among them, almost every Southern state was represented, and how sad to think of a soldier dying from home and filling a stranger's grave with no pitying eye of kindred dear or loved friend to share a tear or of sorrow and regret. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the diary are Serepta's descriptions of slavery and eventually the end of slavery. In 1857, slavery was firmly entrenched and white supremacy was the law of the land. Most of the entries are just matter-of-fact references to servants. By the end of the war, slavery was over. Her entries on slaves constitute a small percentage of the diary. Her recordings about enslaved people and the institution of slavery are simply a part of her everyday world. When modern American thinks of slavery ending, they usually think of it this way. The South fought to continue slavery. The North fought to end slavery. The North won. Slavery ended. However, gaining freedom was messy, bitter, and hard fought, and this diary shows that. The stakes could not have been higher. Loss of valuable property for the whites, and yet freedom for the African Americans. In In 1858, she recorded a horrifying incident of violence. A white business owner was murdered and his slave was suspected. A mob captured the enslaved man and strung him up. As the man was hanging but not yet dead, he indicated he wanted to say something. They took him down. He said he killed his owner because of the horrible and repeated beatings and torturous treatment. If expecting leniency, he was wrong. The crowd, now satisfied with the confession of guilt, strung him back up and left his dead body hanging for hours. Serepta watched the whole event and expressed excessive grief and sorrow for the white man. She offered not one word of compassion for the man she saw murdered by a mob of her friends and neighbors. In the pre-war years, Serepta wrote of shared labor with Inez. In August 1858, she recorded, quote, "Made Inez an apron this morning, a little Negro girl that Uncle Trice gave me soon after birth. She is now 5 or 6 years old and more sprightly child, black or white, is scarcely to be found." The 1860 slave schedule lists Inez as 7 years old. Her Uncle Trice owned 9 people, the oldest a 45-year-old man, the youngest a 6-year-old girl. And these were the enslaved people with whom Rep would have had the closest interactions. If Serepta had not recorded Inez's age, the reader would have assumed she was older, given the labor she performed, sometimes by herself and sometimes with her owner. Jordan sometimes wrote of pride of Inez and showed concern for her health and records her being happy when Inez is happy. She had her vaccinated. Once when Inez was extremely ill, she brought in Dr. Haskins, Nanny's father. An entry in February 1861 exhibits the complicated attitude of Serepta toward Inez. "Inez is the only piece of property which I've the least claim, and the only servant for whom I've much love, and is now in bed and very ill. Her death will give me much pain should it occur, yet I can scarcely hope for her recovery. The attack has been so violent. Dr. H, I fear, is not sufficiently acquainted with the disease to afford much relief. How can I give her up?" The last sentence is ambiguous. Was Serepta contemplating the loss of a child she loves, or the loss of her only financial asset, or both? As soon as Union troops entered Clarksville, they pressed African Americans to perform manual labor for the Army. By December of 1863, the fort near Serepta's home became a recruiting and training camp for African Americans, members of the United States Colored Troops. Approximately 3,000 African Americans from Clarksville and surrounding counties joined the Union Army. Serepta recorded disgust of seeing Black men in Union uniforms. She wrote, "Went over to Cousin James this evening. The Negro pickets were stationed just across the street from us, and a more contemptible sight I didn't care to see. I thought a view of the regiment from a distance was bad enough. They were practicing this evening for tonight, I suppose, trying to mimic the Yankees. 'Halt,' they would say with the Yankee brogue, and then 'Who comes there?' End quote." Ironically, as a testament to the changing fortune of war, by the end of the war, BB and Serepta Homer, in order to make ends meet, rented a room to the white officer who commanded the USCT. African Americans began to free themselves and went to what were called contraband camps. In May 1863, she wrote, quote, "All the Negroes round were flocking to the abolition Negro thieves down at the fort, and Winnie, one of Uncle T's women, had gone along among the rest. She left a good home, and I hope she will have cause to regret it." Trice successfully appealed to the Union commander to obtain Winnie's child. She wrote, "Uncle Trice has at last succeeded in getting Ida, Winnie's baby, and Colonel Bruce has given an order for Winnie herself, though I think his getting her is rather improbable, as the abolition Yankees have sworn vengeance against him for taking the child. It would not surprise me to hear at any time that they had attempted to take his life or burn him out. In September, Winnie came to get her child with 2 Union officers, but Trice refused to recognize their authority over his property. Quote, Winnie, escorted by 2 Yankee soldiers, walked up to the gate and demanded her child. Uncle Trice came up in the meantime, took possession of Winnie. So now the soldiers are fighting Trice over Winnie. She writes, the Yankees have succeeded in getting her off somewhere. She called him a liar and almost cursed him. Such independence, I suppose, never escaped a Negro's lips. I expect he almost, if not was quite killed. So even with Union soldiers, Winnie not only failed to secure getting her child, but she was almost re-enslaved herself. The next day, Trice heard that Winnie was in Hopkinsville and asked Mr. Homer to go with him to investigate, but to no avail. The final time Winnie is mentioned is 4 months later. Cousin Jane was telling me yesterday that Winnie has gotten back to camp. What will Uncle T and Miss T do now? They are leaving Christian County almost by the 100. Uncle T and Miss F, that's Uncle Trice and his new wife Fanny, and they are the African Americans, and they're leaving in large numbers, almost by the hundreds. Young Inez proved to be instrumental in helping fill the family coffers. In early 1864, Serepta and Inez worked together to sell produce to the military camp, earning essential income. Apparently, Homer did not like Inez's attitude, or perhaps he was suspicious she planned to leave. He beat her more than once. It seems that Inez pretended to be contrite as the beatings worked, and be contrite as if the beatings worked, as she bided her time to leave. Quote, it was after 3 this evening when Inez had time to go to camp. She sold 49 cents worth of milk for me, and doing quite well for a little thing like her. The whipping Mr. H gave her this morning had a very agreeable effect. The next day, Homer beat Inez again, Serepta wrote. Had been busy all day making Inez's dress. She has been unusually sweet since the beating this morning. Went to camp and made for me 95 cents. This week, my milk and butter has brought me in over $6. Soon I will have made $50. Where has it all gone? On February 19th, 1864, Inez left. This morning, at the first tap of the drum over at the camp, I awakened Inez, and as usual, she dressed, made the fire, and had the room half swept before going out. I waited, of course, thinking she would be in directly, but to my surprise, she kept staying after 15 minutes. I remarked to Mr. Homer that she had gone to the Yankees. So then she goes and checks. She says, I found helter-skelter, and I knew from the very appearance of things that she intended going last night. At dinner, Margaret came to let me know that Inez was at her house and that she had gone with great tales in regard to my treatment. She couldn't please me, and I couldn't tell what all. I simply remarked that Inez had left without any good reason whatsoever, and she would never set foot on this place if I could prevent it. Serepta just could not believe that Inez would have negative things to say or even want to leave. Inez's fate is unknown. By Serepta's own account, she was smart. She knew how to make a good business transaction. She was only about 11 when she gained freedom. So we can only hope she made a good life. Serepta was vague when discussing intimate issues and did not record conversations she had with the 2 young suitors, Tom Traub and John Mallory. Both of them enlisted in the Confederacy. After they left, she corresponded with both. Traub died in the war. Throughout the diary, though, almost nightly, B.B. Homer visited and he persistently pursued marriage. She always referred to him as Mr. Homer. Her entries were ambivalent about him at best. She often criticized him, recounting their quarrels, and complained about him annoying her or drinking too much. Yet she recorded several occasions of combing his hair, which seems to indicate an intimacy. He was persistent, though, and never gave up despite her friendship with the young man, and they married. Christmas 1863 was her first as Mrs. Homer, and it was extremely sad and disappointing for her. She rose Christmas morning and woke Inez to see, quote, what old Kris Kringle has brought. It did me good to see how she enjoyed the presents, simple though they were. She described her gift to Homer. I made him a pretty and neat little watch case, hoping in return he would at least make me a present of something a little similar to what Aunt T had always been in the habit of giving me. He didn't give her anything. Instead, he told her she must be a woman now and put away childish things. And to bring this change, he seems to be absolved. Then she continues writing, and she's talking about her aunt. She said, at her death, I wrote, I lost the last friend that ever cared or felt humor in the least of my childish notions. The name husband seems with some to hold the dearest affections, but for me, it is her name before all others for whom I've received the kindest words. And she underlined kindness. She was so disappointed she declined visiting a neighbor that night and pretended to sew. Later, a cousin sent some pickled apples, but she, quote, was in no frame of mind to even enjoy them. May 1st, 1864, Serepta's entry begins by describing how fatigued she was and how she felt worse and worse through the night. She sent for a doctor who, quote, whose presence was considered indispensable, underlined. She continued, I grew sadly worse until about 11, when to make short a long matter, I gave birth to a wee bit of a girl babe, which after including clothes and all including clothes weighed 5 pounds. Mr. H, with the rest, seemed disappointed that it was not a boy. However, just for the time, I was well pleased, and she underlines that. Serepta found joy in her baby. Quote, 1,000 things I could write about this little treasure, but the want of time and this immense and her immense presence forbids. To write with her in my lap in this great book is quite a serious undertaking. She grows sweeter every day. Serepta's life seemed to remain the same, similar in other ways. She mentions battles and sewing, and she mentions the large number of contrabands coming to Clarksville. She mentions that Mr. Homer is working on his tobacco patch. The last entry is June 2nd, 1864. Quote, little Tabby is growing prettier every day. She's getting so fat it tires me smartly to carry her over to Cousin Jane's. She laughs frequently and now is, in a word, remarkably sprightly for one her age, only 7 weeks. Now, she named her baby after her loving aunt. So that's the end of the diary. It just ends. Serepta has 3 more children. The daughter survived. The son died. She has Evangeline, Eva, and Janie. And then the son, Bailey, died when he was 2. And this, of course, is a picture of them as the girls are grown. Serepta's got gray hair in this picture, holding a book. When Well, okay, I need to mention B.B. Homer died in 1873. So Serepta was a widow with 3 daughters under the age of 10. Then when Eva married, Serepta lived with her some. And this is one of the houses she lived in. This one's in New Providence. Later, she lived in this nice house called Oak Top. At some point, Serepta began spending her winters in Florida, where she managed a small inn. When she died, the newspaper ran her obituary on the front page. Here's what it said. When Mrs. Serepta M. Homer passed away in her home in New Providence this morning at 2 o'clock, one of the best women who lived in Montgomery County died. And this is a slide of the funeral card. She was in 1894 when she passed. She was only 55 years old, which I think is pretty young these days. Here's her monument. Her daughter married a Smith, so this is the Homer Smith plot in Greenwood Cemetery. And thank you for attending. This is me and my husband the night that the book arrived in the mail. It was a very happy day. I mean, it's just amazing to think that all these people spent all these years volunteering their time and effort for this book to be published. It's pretty amazing. Now, if you, I'm not giving book talks and not traveling around like I did with the Nanny Haskins diary. So if you have a copy and you would like to email me, I will send you a signed book plate. Just send me your name and your address and I'll mail you one and you can put it in your book and it'll be signed. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you, Minoa. I'm going to stop the recording now. And if you want to go ahead and leave